Hello, today we'll continue our series of lectures on behavioral science. So far we have covered topics in basic psychology and medical ethics. Now the remaining lectures will cover topics in psychiatry, and we'll turn to the DSM-5 in order to consider the main categories of mental illnesses. Now the DSM-5 stands for Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and this is basically the manual where all American psychiatrists have they're guided by this manual because, well, every few years psychiatrists in America get together in order to reconsider some of the diagnostic criteria for many of the mental disorders. Now, this document, the DSM-5, this book, is called like that, Diagnostical Statistical Manual, because in order to make some changes, they keep track of the statistics. So they want to pay attention to, how many cases of each mental disorder there are, and so on. So before we get to the topic of mental illnesses, and we'll cover many of them, and we'll dedicate quite a few lectures to those topics, before we get to that, we need to cover the topic of epidemiology and basic statistics. And epidemiology has to do with, how you keep track of numbers of specific diseases in given populations, and also the risk factors, and the different types of studies that are done when it comes to keeping track of how many people with any given specific illness there are. So as a transition from the topics of psychology to the topics of psychiatry, we need to establish a lecture on epidemiology. So today we'll cover this topic. So we'll begin our lecture on epidemiology considering two concepts that are usually confused, especially in the media, but also in common parlance. Which are prevalence and incidence. And I can assure you that if you listen to all my previous lectures, I probably got them confused at least once. So maybe when I wanted to say prevalence, I said incidence, and when I wanted to say incidence, I said prevalence. So this is a very common mistake. Now you need to be aware of what is each, and keep in mind that all of this is included in the USMLE, so the USMLE questions might be a little bit tricky when it comes to these concepts, so you need to know them very well. And as in every other lecture, at the end of this lecture, we'll do some review questions we'll do some review questions with questions that resemble the ones on the USMLE. So let's begin with prevalence and incidence. So what is prevalence? Well, prevalence is the number of individuals in the population who have an illness, and then we divide that number by the total population. So let's say that there is a population of 1,000 people, and in that population there are 10 people that suffer from schizophrenia. Well, in that case, we would say that the prevalence of schizophrenia is 10 in 1,000, or it would be the same as 1 in 100. And actually, that's the real prevalence of schizophrenia. Worldwide, you find that for every 100 people, at least most likely one is schizophrenic. That would be prevalence. Now, there's a specific type of prevalence that we call point prevalence, and this is the number of individuals who have an illness at a specific point in time. So, for instance, let's consider the percentage of population that have schizophrenia on today, which is April 20th, 2017. So this is measuring how many people have schizophrenia in a given population at a specific point in time. Now there is also period prevalence, and this is the number of individuals who have an illness during a specific time period. So it's not just one day, but it may also be a month or a year. And the difference here between point prevalence and period prevalence is relevant, because there are some illnesses that may last for shorter or longer periods. So depending on what we're looking for, we can either choose as a measure point prevalence or period prevalence. So let's turn to incidence. And remember, let's not get them confused. Now, incidence is the number of new cases divided by the population at risk during a given time period. So let's take an example. The number of intravenous drug abusers newly diagnosed as HIV positive in 2017 divided by the number of intravenous drug abusers in the population during 2017. Now here we're not looking at people that have HIV in a whole population. That would be prevalence. We're looking here for people who are at risk for any given disease and that actually contract the disease. So in this case, people who are intravenous drug abusers, they are at risk. And if you remember from the previous lecture, well, we discussed about the means of transmission of HIV, and sharing needles is one of them. So this is why people, drug abusers that abuse drugs with intravenous methods, then they are at risk of contracting HIV. Now, taking that the whole set of that population that are at a special risk, when we take the newly diagnosed cases and we divide them by the population that is at risk, then we get incidence. So this is different from prevalence. I mean, prevalence could be the number of people with HIV in the whole population. Incidence would be the measure of newly diagnosed people with HIV, that is to say, the new ones that are coming in, out of the population that is at risk. So we divide those two, and then we get incidence. So in order to understand this, we could use a metaphor, and this is frequently used in epidemiological studies and in behavioral science courses, the metaphor of the sink. So we want to measure how much water there is, but there are various ways of measuring this. I mean, if we want to study the prevalence, well, we will study how much water there is in the sink or in the bathtub, right? So how much of the sink is occupied by water, that would be the prevalence. So, I mean, let's say that the whole space taken by the sink or the bathtub, that's the whole population. How much of that is covered by water, that would be the prevalence. And in epidemiological terms, that would be the number of people that have the disease compared to the whole population. Now, incidence would be the new water coming in. So those would be the new cases. There's a difference. I mean, prevalence is the number of people that have the disease, whereas incidence, it's the new people coming in. So that is to say, the newly diagnosed cases. Now, this can change. I mean, if you have a lot of incidence, then of course, the prevalence is going to go up. But there are some things that can change the prevalence as well. And there are basically two mechanisms. They can be either cure or death. And in the metaphor of the sink, it would be the drain. So if you open a hole in the bottom of the sink or in the bottom of the bathtub, a lot of water will come out. Now, depending on how big that hole, more or less water will come out. But how do you decrease the prevalence of a disease in a given population? Well, there are really two ways of doing it. You do it with either cure, I mean, you cure the people, so there is a lesser number of people that have the disease, but it could also be that they die. Now, I mean, from an epidemiological point of view, from an ethical point of view, it's terrible that they die. But from an epidemiological point of view, it's not so bad because there are less people. There are less people that have the disease, I mean. So we can understand the relation between prevalence and incidence by saying that prevalence is equal to the incidence rate multiplied by the average duration of the disease process. Now, keep in mind something. This is not an actual mathematical formula. This is only a principle showing that the higher the duration of the disease, the higher the prevalence. So if we go back to the bathtub, I mean, if we say that the drain or the hole where the water goes away in the bottom of the bathtub, if the hole is small enough, well, that would be similar to saying that the disease will be quite long. And if that is the case, then the prevalence will augment, will be much higher. So that is why we're saying that the higher the duration of the disease, the higher the prevalence. So you expect higher prevalence in those diseases that are not fatal, that are, that their duration time is very short. You expect a higher prevalence in those diseases where their duration time is actually longer. Now, as I was saying, the duration can be affected either by cure or mortality. I mean, if a disease is easily cured, well, the prevalence will be lower. But also, if the disease is very fatal and people die almost immediately, then the prevalence will also be lower. So we can understand the relation between prevalence and incidence by saying that prevalence is greater than incidence if the disease is long-term. So, for example, because let's take diabetes as an example. Well, because diabetes lasts a lifetime, so people do not die immediately from diabetes, but they're not cured from diabetes immediately either. In fact, it's a chronic condition that people have to learn most of the time how to live with this, with long-term treatment. So because diabetes lasts a lifetime, its prevalence is much higher than its incidence. So, there may not be many new cases coming in, so diabetes may have a low incidence, but nevertheless, prevalence is high because the new cases add up and people are neither cured nor dead. So the new cases coming in may not be as many, but they accumulate because people are neither cured nor dead. So that increases the prevalence. Now, on the other hand, the prevalence of influenza, which is an acute illness, so you're either cured or you died, is approximately to the equal of the incidence. So again, the longer the duration of the disease, the higher the prevalence. So let's take another example. A town in the western United States has a population of 1,200 people. So in 2016, 200 residents of the town are diagnosed with a disease. And in 2017, 100 residents of the town are discovered to have the same disease. So the disease is lifelong and chronic, but not fatal. So let's try to figure out what the incidence and the prevalence are in this example. Well, the incidence, remember, is the number of new cases divided by the population at risk during a given time. So in this case, there are 100 new cases. Now the population at risk here, it's 1,000, not 1,200. And let's consider why. It's 1,000 because out of the 1,200 residents that town has, 12 already have the disease. So they're no longer at risk, or they're no longer considered to be at risk. I mean, they already have the disease. So it's basically a lost cause in their case. So the population at risk is the population that may get the disease, but still hasn't got it. And in this case, if we have a population of 1,200 and 200 of them already have the disease, so the population at risk is 1,000. Now, if in 2017, 100 residents of the town got this disease, then the incidence would be 100 divided by 1,000. Now remember, not 1,200, but 1,000 because that's the population at risk. So as you can see, the incidence in this case would be 100 divided by 1,000. It would be 0.1. Now let's calculate here the prevalence. Now remember, the prevalence is the number of individuals in the population who have an illness divided by the total population. So how many individuals have the disease now? Well, remember, there were 200 before, and now there are 100 new cases, which were the ones that we used in order to calculate the incidence. So there would be a total of 300 individuals with the disease. Now, if the total population is 1,200, and in this case it is 1,200, not 1,000, because remember we used 1,000 because it was the number of people that were at risk. In prevalence, we're not considering the people that are at risk, but rather the whole population. So it would be 300 divided by 1,200. So in this case, we would get 0.25. So we can tell that in this case, the prevalence is 25% and the incidence is 10%. So keep in mind the difference between those two important concepts, because I can tell you that there is a 99% chance that this will come up in the USMLE, the difference between prevalence and incidence and how you calculate them. Okay, let's turn to another important topic in epidemiology, and this is cohort studies. Now, cohort studies are studies that compare groups over a period of time. You have to keep in mind that epidemiology very frequently uses a comparative approach. If you want to learn about if you want to know the causes of any specific disease in any given population, well, you usually have to compare the two. And you have to usually compare different populations. And one way of doing this is with cohort studies. So cohort studies are studies that compare groups over a period of time. So the way this is usually done is that, first of all, there is the identification of a risk factor. So for instance, let's say smoking. So you would do a cohort studies to find out how people that smoke are more at risk for some diseases than people that do not smoke. So in the case of cohort studies, if we take the risk factors such as smoking, two groups would be formed. We would get a population of made up of individuals who smoke, and then we would get a population of individuals who do not smoke. And the way to proceed this is that after some given time, we would study them separately, and we would compare how they do in any given specific illness in order to decide how much of a factor is that risk factor that we're trying to study. So the way we would proceed here is that there would be a comparison of the two groups over time. So for instance, we would ask which of the two groups, either the smokers or the non-smokers, develop lung cancer in greater rates. And of course, you can probably tell in advance that if we do cohort studies and we compare a population made up of people smoking and a population made up of people not smoking, we can anticipate that the results will probably determine that the people who smoke develop lung cancer in greater rates. Now, a variant of cohort studies are clinical treatment trials. Now, in this case, what it's usually do is that the two groups with the same illness are separated. Now, instead of considering the risk factors, here we're going to consider not the risk factors, but some treatments. So one group, remember, these two groups have the same disease, they have the same illness, but one group is given a new treatment and another group is given a placebo, or the traditional treatment that they have been following. So the point of this study, which is a clinical treatment trial, is that over a period of time, the groups are compared to study the effects of the new treatment. So we'll see if the group that took the new treatment is doing better than the group that followed the placebo or the traditional treatment. Now, a placebo, we'll get to this shortly, but for the time being, we can say that the placebo is a substance that is taken that doesn't really have any pharmacological effect, but does have some psychosomatic effect. I mean, and this has been discussed by a lot of psychologists. At least in 33% of the time when you take a pharmacological treatment, in 33% of the people that take it, regardless of what that treatment may be, they may have some improvement. Now, placebo is that, because medicine has a psychosomatic component, an important psychosomatic component, it may be that people taking a particular pill may eventually become better just by taking the pill, no matter what the pharmacological composition of that pill is. Now, in these trials, we want to make sure that the pill that is that is being used as a new treatment provides results that go beyond the placebo. So we want to make sure that if there is an improvement in the patients that are taking a new treatment, that is not just due to some psychosomatic effect, but we want to make sure that the treatment is really working on its own. And the way this is usually tested is with clinical treatment trials. So what does cohort studies measure? Well, cohort studies measure relative risk. And what is relative risk? Well, relative risk is a measure that compares the incidence rate of a disorder among individuals exposed to a risk factor with the incidence rate of the disorder in non-exposed individuals. So relative risk is trying to compare, let's go back to the example of smokers and non-smokers. So we want to decide, we want to compare out of the group that's smoking and the group that's non-smoking, which one develops a greater rate of lung cancer. So in that case, we would be looking at relative risk, and we would be comparing the incidence rate, remember the new cases of the population at risk, the incidence rate of a disorder among individuals exposed to a risk factor with the incidence rate of the disorder in unexposed individuals. So we would want to study how many new cases are in each population, and by comparing the two, we would get a relative risk, and that would give us an idea of how much of a risk factor, in this case, smoking, how much of a risk factor in lung cancer smoking is. So the way you calculate relative risk is by dividing the incidence rate with the risk factor divided by the incidence rate without the risk factor. So let's say that you have a group of 100 people that are in the smoking group and 100 people that are in the non-smoking group. Now let's say that out of the people that are in the smoking group, 10 develop lung cancer, and in the incidence and in the group of people that do not smoke, you only get one person with cancer. So the incidence rate with risk factor would be 10 over 100, and you would divide that by the incidence rate without the risk factor, which would be 1 in 100. Or let's use another example that I have here in the slide. Let's suppose that the incidence rate of lung cancer among smokers is 0.02. So let's suppose that in a given year, out of 1,000 smoking people who did not have cancer, 20 were diagnosed. And let's suppose that the incidence rate of lung cancer among non-smokers, it's 2 in 1,000, so 0.002. So that means that in a given year, out of 1,000 non-smoking people who did not have cancer, 20 were diagnosed. I'm sorry, not 20, 2 were diagnosed. So the relative risk would be the incidence of the group where the risk factor is present divided by the incidence of, I'm sorry, the other way around, the incidence of the group where the risk is not present divided by the incidence of the group where the risk is present. So in this case, it would be 0.002 divided by 0.02. And that would give us a measure of 10. So in this case, the relative risk would be 10. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that the risk of getting lung cancer is 10 times greater, and the number 10 here comes from the relative risk, is 10 times greater in a smoker than in a non-smoker. And it's called relative risk because you are making a relation between the two groups, the one that has the risk factor and the ones that doesn't have the risk factor. We also have another measure, which is attributable risk. And the question here is, what would happen in a study population if the risk factor was removed? So, for instance, we would be considering, or we would be determining how common lung cancer would be in a study if people did not smoke. So how do we calculate that? Well, we calculate the incidence rate of illness in non-smoking individuals minus the incidence rate of illness in smoking individuals. And this calculation would give us attributable risk, which is answering the question of what would happen in a study population if the risk factor was removed. So in this case, if people stopped smoking, what would be the risk? What would be the risk for getting cancer, or how common it would be getting cancer if people did not smoke? Okay, there are also case control studies, and these cases begin with the identification of subjects who have a specific illness and subjects who do not have that illness. So this basically works backwards. So you get people that have lung cancer and people who do not have lung cancer, and you ask them what was their lifestyle like in the past. So you ask them, you ask the patients with cancer whether or not they smoked in the past, and you ask the patients without cancer whether or not they smoke in the past. So an example would be, well, group A, there are cancer patients, and group B, healthy patients. They are compared to get around the differences in risk factors. And I bet that in this case, well, group A, the prevalence of patients that are smokers is much higher than in group B. Now, for case control studies, there will be four types of groups eventually. There will be a group that has the disease but is not exposed to risk factor. There will be another group that has the disease and was exposed to risk factor. There will be a group that does not have the disease, or the healthy patients, but they were nevertheless exposed to the risk factor. And there will be a group of people who do not have the disease and were not exposed to the risk factor. So in this case, the disease would be lung cancer and the risk factor would be smoking. So the odds ratio is a measure for control studies. And the way this usually works is that we create a matrix and we calculate it with exposed individuals with illness. So in this case, it would be A. We would consider the exposed individuals without the illness. We would consider unexposed individuals with illness and unexposed individuals without illness, and we would assign them A, B, C, or D in each case. Now, how do we calculate the odds ratio? Well, we would multiply A times D divided by B times C. So let's take a look at a more specific example. We have the matrix there. So we have people with cancer and people without cancer. We have smokers and we have non-smokers. So let's take a specific case. Let's say that in a total population of 200 patients in a hospital, 50 have lung cancer. So if we say that 50 have lung cancer, well, the remaining 150 do not have lung cancer. Now, of those 50, and you can see here the total 50 in the right, of those 50, 45 are smokers. So that would be A, and that would be people with the disease and people who are exposed to the risk. Of the remaining 155 hospitalized patients who do not have lung cancer, 60 are smokers. So it would be C. So that would be people without the disease, but that are nevertheless exposed to the risk. Now, the other numbers are not tell in the example, but we can figure them out. I mean, if we have a total of 50 people with cancer and 45 are smokers, then we will have a group of 5 people that are non-smokers, but that nevertheless have cancer. And if we have 150 patients without cancer and 60 are smokers, then we can figure out that the rest are smokers as well. We would figure out that value D would be 90, because if we have 150 people without cancer and 60 of those are smokers, then we can figure out that 90 people without cancer are non-smokers. So the way you calculate odds ratio is by multiplying A times D. So A times D would be 45 times 90, and that gives us a result of, let me calculate it here in the calculator, 45 times 90. That would be 4,050. We're going to divide that by B times C, which would be 60 times 5. So it would be 4,050 divided by 60 times 5. So that would be 300. So 4,050 divided by 300, that would give us 13.5. So in this case, 13.5 would be the risk of lung cancer. That would be, the risk of lung cancer would be 13.5 times higher in people who smoke than in those who do not smoke. And this measure would be odds ratio. So the odds ratio for the odds ratio in this case, it's comparing smokers with non-smokers and people who have cancer with people who do not have cancer, it would be 13.5. And remember, what this means is that the risk of lung cancer, that is to say the disease we're studying, is 13.5 times higher in people who are exposed to the risk, that is to say smoking, than in those who are not exposed to the risk, that is to say those who do not smoke. Now, when you do many of these studies, there is always a danger of biases, and biases are, interfering in the data, maybe unconsciously so, but that ultimately that influences the results, and it doesn't really show the results as they really are. So there are many types of biases in studies. First of all, there is a selection bias, and it could be that the subjects are permitted to choose whether or not to go with drug A or drug B. This is in clinical treatment trials, rather than assign them randomly. And this may significantly alter the results, because if people are permitted to choose, then you're not really getting random samples, and this could influence the way that the data turns out to be. It could also happen if the investigator purposely chooses which patients go into drug group A and which patients go into drug group B. There is also a recall bias, which is the knowledge of the presence of a disorder alters the way the subject remembers his or her history. So in this case, let's say a patient has cancer. If you ask them whether or not they smoke, well, someone may answer that in as much as they know that they have cancer, that may influence their information they provide, and they may say in the survey that they smoke more than they actually did. And that may be one way of for them saying, well, yeah, this is why I developed cancer. So this is why the knowledge of the presence of a disorder alters the way the subject remembers his or her history. Or it may also be the other way around. I mean, maybe the patient will say, well, no, I only smoked a cigarette, well, in order to be free of guilt, saying, well, I got cancer, but it really doesn't have anything to do with my previous lifestyle. And it may be a fact that instead of smoking one cigarette pack per day, he actually smoked 1.5. So this is recall bias. You cannot always trust what patients tell you about the way they used to have a lifestyle. There are also sampling biases, and this is when the subjects who volunteer to be in a study may not be representative of the population being studied. So let's take an example. Let's say that a researcher wants to measure nutrition in a village. Now he becomes a friend of the chief, and he uses the chief's children as his subjects. Now here the question is, did he do a good sampling? I mean, will those children be representative of nutrition levels in the village? Well, most likely no, because I mean, it's very likely that this sampling is very biased, because it's quite likely that these children, in as much as they are the children of the chief of the village, they are better fed than the rest of the population. So the sampling here is not representative of the population. This would be sampling bias. Now, you must be aware that these biases exist and that they may influence the ultimate result of studies. So there are some ways to reduce bias. So there are techniques. First of all, there are blind studies. Now, the way this works is that expectations to treatment due to psychosomatic factors, I mean, if you really have the expectation that a treatment will cure you, well, it may actually turn out to be that way, but not really because of the pharmacological properties of the treatment, but rather because of the psychosomatic expectation that there may be. So those expectations can influence the outcome. So in order to tackle this problem, we can say that to truly test a treatment and remove bias, it's better that the patient does not know what the treatment is. So that you do not tell him what the treatment actually is, whether it's a placebo or a real treatment. And in as much as the patient doesn't really know, then we'll check out whether or not the treatment is actually working. Now, even if the patient doesn't know, the patient could also get some hints from the doctor. So in order to avoid this bias, it would be better for the doctor not to know either what he's assigning in the treatment trial. So if the doctor does not know either what the real composition of the treatment is, whether it's a real new treatment or whether it's just a placebo, in those cases, if the doctor doesn't know either, that would be called a double-blind study. And in order to be approved, new treatments always have to go through this process of a double-blind study. There are also placebo studies, and this is done with cohort studies. Now remember that cohort studies are studies that compare two groups. So in this case, people receiving the placebo are the control group. I mean, you're going to control the real treatment group with the results of the placebo. If they're both the same, then it turns out that the treatment doesn't really work because it doesn't go beyond the placebo. Now, if the treatment is more significant than the placebo, if it causes, if it relieves symptoms much better than the group that received the placebo, then that would be a significant change. It would be a significant result, and you could say that it's a significant result because you're comparing that with a control. Now, the control group is the one that's given the placebo in order to make sure that the other group is actually, in order to consider the effects of the other group. So those receiving the placebo are the control group, and those receiving the active drug are the experimental group. So as I was saying, the results are compared. Now, what's the purpose of this? Well, the purpose is to make sure that the treatment is really effective and not just psychosomatic. For instance, when there have been treatments for acupuncture and homeopathy, and these are treatments that are not approved, when these treatments are applied to two groups and they're applied to the actual experimental group that are actually given the homeopathic pills, and they're compared to another group that's a placebo, that those patients are told that they're being given the experimental pill, but it's actually just a placebo. Well, in the case of homeopathy, it has invariably turned out to be that both groups do the same. They have the same results. Now, what does that tell you? Well, it tells you that homeopathy, it's not really effective beyond the placebo. So homeopathy may be good for psychosomatic purposes, but it doesn't really have the pharmacological properties that homeopaths attribute them. There are also crossover studies, and in this case, well, initially Group A receives a treatment and Group B receives a placebo, and later the protocol is switched so that Group A receives the placebo and Group B receives the treatment, and you eventually compare them. Now, this gives you a little more chance in order to avoid biases, so that you make sure that those that are receiving the placebo later on are receiving the real drug, and vice versa, in order to make sure that you're not subject to biases. Another way to avoid biases is randomization, and this is that in order to ensure that the proportion of sicker and healthier people is the same in the treatment and in the control or the placebo groups. So patients are randomly assigned to groups. So randomization is another way to avoid biases. Now let's also talk about reliability of tests. If you remember when we talked about intelligence and IQ and different tests in order to measure not only intelligence but also some other psychological variables, and during the first interviews of a psychiatrist with a patient, we talked very briefly, especially in the case of IQ, about reliability. Now, reliability is the quality that a test has of consistently providing the same data. So the question here in reliability is, do the tests provide the same results when another person administers them? So that would be inter-rater reliability. So if we do a study and we get some results, and later on another person does the study and he gets the same results, then we can say that that test is reliable. Now, it can also be a retest reliability. So do the tests provide the same results when the subjects are tested over and over again? So let's say we do a test for any specific condition 1 week, we get the results, and then 1 month later we do it again with the same variables and the same condition. If we get the same result, then we can say that the test has a test-retest reliability. Now, keep in mind that this is only useful if the trait measure is unlikely to change much over time. If it is likely to change much over time, then you should expect that the results will be different, and if the results are different, then that shouldn't really be considered you shouldn't really consider that the test doesn't have a test-retest reliability, because it is expected that the results should change. Now, test-retest reliability is only useful if the trait measure is unlikely to change much over time. If you remember from our discussion on IQ, apart from reliability, there is also validity of test. So this is what this is asking is, does the test really measure what it claims to measure? In the case of IQ, remember that there were some concerns about that. I mean, does IQ tests are reliable because when they are applied over and over again, we get the same results, no matter who applies the test and no matter what period of time they're applied. I mean, the results are consistent. But there's the issue of validity. I mean, does IQ really measure intelligence? Do intelligent people really score higher in IQ tests? And there have been some criticism against IQ tests because they may not be as valid as they are usually claimed to be. Now, when you do some of these tests, there could be false positives and false negatives. There can be true positives and true negatives. So let's say that you are going to do some tests on HIV in a given population. You want to find out who has HIV and who doesn't. Well, in this case, when you run those tests, the true positives would be the ill people that the test has correctly identified as having the HIV virus. Now, the false negatives are the people that have the HIV virus, but that the test has incorrectly identified them as not having the HIV virus. So there are true positives and false negatives. False positives are the people that do not have the HIV virus, but that the test has incorrectly identified them as having the HIV virus. Those are false positives. And true negatives are the people who are sane, but whom the test has correctly identified as being sane. So this would be the people that do not have the HIV virus, and the test tells us that they do not have the HIV virus. Those would be the true negatives. So keeping those factors into account, there is also another measure regarding false positive, false negative, true positives, and true negatives. And they are sensitivity and specificity. Now, sensitivity, you get that by dividing true positives by the sum of true positives and false negatives. Sensitivity, in this case, would measure how well a test identifies truly ill people. So sensitivity would be a measure to decide whether or not an HIV test, how good that HIV test is at telling us how many people actually have the HIV virus. Whereas specificity, you get this measure by dividing the true negatives divided by the sum of true negatives plus false positives. So what specificity tells us, or it measures, is how well a test identifies people that do not have HIV in this case. So it measures how well a test identifies truly well people. And there's also the measure of a predictive value. So this would be the measure of the percentage of test results that match the actual diagnosis. So in the case of positive predictive value, it would be the true positive divided by the true positive plus the true negative. And what this value tells us is the probability that someone with a positive test, that is to say someone who really has HIV, I mean, we're saying positive not in the moral sense, not in the sense of getting good news, but whether or not the condition is present. So a positive predictive value is the probability that someone with a positive test actually has the illness. So if someone is diagnosed with HIV and they want to know whether or not that diagnosis is correct, well, if that test, if you tell the patient what the positive predictive value for that test is, the patient can gather the idea about what is the probability that in his case, who has been diagnosed with HIV, he actually has HIV. Now, negative predictive value is the other way around, and it's calculated by dividing the true negative divided by the true negative plus the false negative. And what this measure tells you is the probability that someone with a negative test actually is well. So let's say that you want to do an HIV screening test, and the test comes out saying that it's HIV negative, so you do not have the disease or the virus. But let's say that you are a little bit concerned because you want to make sure that that test really is accurate when it tells people that they do not have HIV? Well, you can ask the lab what the negative predictive value is, and when they do the calculation by taking into consideration the true negatives and the false negative, well, that calculation will tell the patient what the probability is that in his case, because he got a negative test, that he actually does not have HIV. Okay, so let's do a couple of USMLE questions that deal with these topics. Let's go with the first one. A study is designed to determine the relationship between emotional stress and ulcers. So to do this, the researchers use hospital records of patients diagnosed with peptic ulcer disease and patients diagnosed with other disorders over the periods from July 2016 to July 2017. The amount of emotional stress each patient was exposed to was determined from these records. So the study is best described as A, cohort study, B, cross-sectional study, C, case control study, D, historical cohort study, or E, clinical treatment trial. Well, I think here the answer would be C, case control study. Now remember that in these types of study, you take a population that has the disease and you take a population that does not have the disease and you compare their past. There may be some biases in their recall, of course, but there are ways to deal with this, and we've already gone through some of them. But in the case of case control studies, what you do is that you take the two populations, the one that has the disease and the one that doesn't have the disease, and you go back in order to compare their different exposure to different risks. And this is the way this is proceeding. And the question is telling you, or the premise of the question is telling us that to do this, to compare to study the relationship between emotional stress and ulcers, the researchers use hospital records of patients diagnosed with peptic ulcer and patients diagnosed with other disorders. So the amount of emotional stress each patient was exposed to was determined from these records. So we want to see how much stress do patients with ulcers have and how much stress do patients without ulcers have, and going backwards we can actually determine how much of a factor stress is when it comes to ulcers. Okay, let's take a look at another one. A study is done to determine the effectiveness of a new antihistamine. To do this, 25 allergic patients are assigned to one of two groups. The new drug that is given to 13 patients and a placebo that is given to 12 patients. So the patients are then followed for a period of 6 months. So how can this study be described? A, cohort studies, B, cross-sectional studies, C, case control study, D, historical cohort study, or E, clinical treatment trial. Well, this is typically a clinical treatment trial. Remember that in clinical treatment trial, you take people with the same disease, but you separate them. And to one group, you give them the real drug. To the other group, you give them the placebo, and you compare them. They must have the same disease at the beginning, but what you want to really measure is how efficient the drug is beyond the placebo. So to one group you give placebo, and of course in order for this to be placebo it has to be blind, and if it's double blind it's even better. So you give if it's double blind, the doctor doesn't really know what drug he's giving to what group, and the patients don't really know what drug they're receiving. Only the experimenters know this, and then the other group are actually given the drug, and after some period they are compared. And if there is a significant difference, then we can say that the drug is actually effective. If there is no significant difference between the two groups, then we can say that the effects of the drugs do not go beyond the placebo. And if that is the case, then it's not pharmacologically as significant. Okay, let's do another one. After a new antidepressant has been on the market for 5 years, it is determined that 2,400 people who have taken the drugs, it is determined that out of 2,400 people that have taken the drug, 360 complain of persisting nausea. If a physician has 2 patients on this antidepressant, the probability that both of them will experience persisting nausea is approximately A, 0.02, B, 0.09, C, 0.24, D, 0.30, or E, 0.64? Well, the answer here is tricky, and you have to be mathematically literate because it's not just about epidemiology, it's also about probability. But I'm sure this is some stuff that you learned in high school because it's very basic probability measure. If we say that the probability that the patient will get the nausea, well, the probability is 360 times divided by the 2400. So 360 divided by 2400, that should get us 0.15. Now that's the probability for one patient getting nausea. Now in order to calculate the probability that two patients will get the nausea, well, you would have to multiply 0.15 times the probability of the other patient. So it would be 0.15 times 0.15, and that would give us 0.0225. Now out of those four options, the one that is closest to 0.0225 is A, 0.02. So the correct answer here would be A, 0.02.